I mean, it's wonderful to be back face to face. The Yeshiva-style, yeah. It's wow, Hashem. So I'm quite emotional. So this is a bit of a learning curve for me, how to cope with a hybrid. I don't know exactly how to make eye contact, who I make eye contact with, but we'll try and make this work. And if someone asks on screen a question, I'll repeat it to everyone. And if someone asks live a question, I'll also repeat it to everyone. So we're starting a new sugya of Ibud, and the Gemara says as follows. This is at the top of Ayin Hayom base. So the Mishnah, as we have it, lists two of its melachos, Melicha and Ibud. Someone posted on the WhatsApp group the link to a Wikipedia. I think Josh, was you a link to a Wikipedia article about what exactly tanning is. I struggle to understand actually exactly how the Gemara fits with what's described as the tanning process. But either way, the melacha of Ibud is somehow preserving skin. So if you take skin and you just keep it the way it is, it will go moldy. But if you dry it using salt and through osmosis, salt obviously draws out the moisture, and then you tan it by using a mix of chemicals, then that dries the skin, and then it doesn't go moldy, and then it becomes a usable skin. Usable for leather garments and shoes and belts and the like, and in the and also in the context of the Mishnah, also for parchment for writing, because the Mishnah is listing the chaburah, the kosev. There's many the Mishnah lists different processes of melachos. So, for example, the process that we spent a lot of time looking at was the 11 melachos that lead to the production of bread. And here the Mishnah is listing the melachos that lead to the production of a writing, which involves having to trap an animal seder, and shochet, having to kill the animal, as we've seen in the previous shiurim, and then having to produce parchment through tanning, and finally writing, which is the melachot of kosev. Now, I mentioned already several times that this structure of the melachos doesn't parallel the Mishkan. Meaning, even though we derive the melachos from the Mishkan, the order in which the Mishnah arranges them to line them up isn't identical to the structure of the Mishnah of the Mishkan. So, for example, we saw this in the Mishkan. There was no afiyah taking place. It wasn't afiyah of pus that was taking place. It was bishul of samamonim. The melachos we don't learn from the running of the Mishkan, in which there is bread, the lechem aponim. We learn from the creation of the Mishkan, in which there was samamonim, herbs were boiled in order to produce dye. Nonetheless, the Mishnah lists a whole seder, a whole order, as if it was with wheat and bread, finally culminating in afiyah, which is the baking of bread. Similarly, in the Mishkan, we'll see later, the kosev, the ksiva, the writing that took place in the Mishkan, in the production, was in the manufacture of the Mishkan, was labeling the various poles and beams that were used in the Mishkan, so they could be re-put in their right places. Nonetheless, the Mishnah, as we have it, lists a seder of the production of writing material, and therefore lists Ibud in the process of tanning for producing parchment, even though in the Mishkan, the tanning was done to produce the oros, the skins that were used for the canopy, the sort of cloth that was overlaid over the cloth of the Mishkan. So either way, Ibud is a melacha, whether as in the Mishkan for the production of the skins that were used for the covering of the Mishkan, or as it is in how the Mishnah lists it in human need in terms of producing material for writing and communication. Says the Gemara, Hainu Meleach v'Hainu Ma'aved. Surely Meleach and Ma'aved are the same thing, which we need to look at to see what that means. So let's remove one of them, either Melicha or Ibud. It doesn't really make a difference which, because they're both the same melacha, and instead put in sirtut, which is scratching or marking a line for some purpose or other, which we'll look at later. So there's really two stages to this Gemara that we need to analyze. Stage one is, three stages. Stage one is, what is Melicha and Ibud, and why does the Gemara think they're the same? Stage two is which one it gets rid of and how, and stage three is what the melacha of sirtut is, why sirtut should be listed in the Mishnah in its place. and that's what we're going to try and understand in the sugya. So Rashi says, "Hainu meleach, hainu ma'abed, otu melicha lav tzorech ibutu." Is melicha not the tzorech of ibud? Is melicha not needed or done for the sake of ibud? Now, when I saw these words of Rashi, it was very reminiscent to me of a shiur that we had, a topic we looked at many months back at the top of Ayin Hey Amud Aleph, when we looked at the sugya of moteach. So if you remember in the context of tefira, of sewing, the Gemara spoke about metichas hachut, the tautening or tightening of a thread. And there we saw the language of the Rambam, in which the Rambam spoke about meticha being mitzarchei hatefira. Tightening a thread is from the needs of tefira. In other words, when you sew, part of the sewing process is you also have to make the thread taut, and therefore the Rambam said this is a melacha yochayiv because it's sarchei hatefira. It's needed for the tefira. Now, I'll remind you again what we've seen since really starting at the Mishnah of the melachos, that the relationship between Ovos and Toldus, and indeed within Ovos themselves, is not simple at all. Before one learns Masechet Shabbat, one sort of has an image of 39 categories of melacha, of Ovos, and then sub-melachas, which somehow are different ways of doing the Av or something like that, and these are called Toldus. But we've seen that this is not really the correct picture. Both Rashi and the Rambam, we looked at this in depth on Ein Gimel Amud Beis when we learnt when we were first dipping our toes into the melachos. Both Rashi and the Rambam understand that you can have co-ovos or twin ovos, which nonetheless fall under one category. So, for example, similar enough production methods, for example, bishul and afiyah, are both ovos, and yet they count as one av, even though they're different. One is cooking and boiling, and one is baking. Nonetheless, they count as one av. Similarly, notea and zorea, planting a sapling and sowing a seed, count as one av, even though these are quite different activities, planting a sapling and sowing a seed. Then you have melachos, which are slightly further afield from the av, even though they have quite a close relationship. And there you might end up with the machlokas rishonim, as we saw several times between Rashi and the Rambam, whether these count as co-ovos or these count as a tolda. So, for example, zomer, pruning. Now, the purpose of pruning is to engender growth. So, is this a co-av with zorea and notea, or has it become too different and then it becomes a tolda? So, tolda is something which somehow is linked to the av and somewhat akin to it, but nonetheless is not similar enough to be the av. And it's very, very hard, and this is something that you see through the Doros really, through the times of the Shonim and the Achronim. It's quite hard to define exactly where the cutoff point is and what exactly defines something as an Av and Tolda. And we've never really gone into that. We've simply sort of labeled, we've seen sometimes Rashi and the Rambam defining one as an Av and one as a Tolda, but it's very hard to put one's finger on exactly how similar it has to be qualified as an Av, and at what point it becomes different and then switches to become a Tolda. But we've also seen something more important, which is that not all Toldas are subcategories of others in the sense of being derived from the Av and sort of another sort of similar way of achieving the same thing. Sometimes they can be quite different to the Av, and it's simply a heading under which this melacha falls, but in essence it's its own melacha. We saw the Gemara later on, which is Megavin Mishum Megavin, Cholev Mishum Cholev. Cheese production, even though it falls perhaps under the category of boner because you're compiling different parts into one unit, nonetheless it's its own melacha. It's just a tolda of the Av, but it's its own melacha, and this is also important over here. The Rambam, as we saw on many occasions, seems to have an understanding that it's sorech, something which is a need of a melacha, an important enough and significant enough need, where it's hard to define how important and how significant the need has to be, but and intertwined enough with the Av as part of the process of arriving at the Av, this also counts as a tolda. And we saw several examples of that in the Rambam. And I printed these on the source sheet. The first example we saw was Motea Chut Shel Tefira, where the Rambam says explicitly, this is Sarchei HaTefira. This is the needs of sewing. Now, tautening a thread and sewing are two different melachas, or two different activities. Nonetheless, the Rambam understands that one is that sorech is a preparatory need of sewing, and therefore it's similar enough that it's and important enough that it's its own melacha in its own right, but that melacha is a tolda of the av. Again, so we're using svara over here of some sort or other. The Gemara seems to be using svara to understand, even though this isn't something that was found in the Mishkan, and therefore it can't be an av, nonetheless, since it's part of the process, it should be a tolda. Then the Rambam in Perek Ches Halacha Beis, which I also printed, says Hashoyer Chitin or Sa'oyin or Chliyot Memamayim Haizeh Tolda Zoreah. Rambam says soaking grain in water is a tolda of Zoreah. Now, again, we saw earlier the Radvaz on this Rambam. The Rambam here doesn't say it explicitly, but the Radvaz on the Rambam understands this to be another example of a tzorach type melacha. When you soak grains, it's true they can germinate a little bit, they can sprout a little bit. Perhaps you've done this with avocado stones or with potatoes, whatever, you hang them over water, they sprout a little bit. But certainly a grain is not going to grow into a wheat stalk without it being embedded in the soil. And therefore the Radvaz understands that it's not zoreah in its own right, because nothing will happen out of this seed, but you soak it in order to prepare it for zuriya, for genuine zuriya. The way a seed works is it has a husk or shell around it, which is quite tough. And when you put it in the ground, if it's moist enough, the shell cracks open and the DNA begins getting to work and it begins sprouting, and that's the germination process. If it's a drier soil or a tougher soil, or you want to speed it up, you'll soak it in liquid, and that will soften the shell, and then you'll put it in the ground and it will grow better. So the Radvaz understands this Rambam to be another example of a tzorech type melacha, and therefore a tolda. The Rambam gives another explicit example of this, and again I printed this in Perek Tes Halacha Yud Aleph with schita. The Rambam says that schita is a tzorchei kibbutz. This sort of schita is from the needs of kibbutz, k'moshe hagosa mitzorchei habishul, in the same way as stirring is from the needs of bishul. The Rambam seems to be saying that hagosa isn't bishul itself. I mean, you're not putting the food on the fire. You could have understood that since you're stirring, you're causing the contents of the pot to move around and therefore get better access to the heat. And therefore this is literally bishul or something of the sort. The Rambam seems to say it's a tolda of bishul because it's mitzorchei habishul. So again, a similar idea. And finally, another case where the Rambam doesn't say mitzorchei, but it would appear to be the same idea. And we also saw this one in Perek Tes Halacha Yud Aleph, is ein hatzeva, ha'isa ein hatzeva. If dyeing is an av melachot, seveya, dyeing, coloring cloth, fabric is an av melachot, you take a fabric and you soak it in liquid, and it's designed so that it holds fast, that the dye sticks fast to the cloth. That's the melachot of seveya. The Rambam says if you make dye itself, by taking liquid and putting the herbs in it or whatever it is to color it and to cause the liquid to pick up the color, the Rambam says this is a tolda of tzvei and chayiv. And again, many of the Mepharshim understand that it's a tzorech melacha. It's because it's so intertwined and necessary for the melacha of tzvei that it counts as a tolda.
Where does it say that it's Masechet is defined as tolda?
It's not entirely clear. In Halacha Tes, in Perek Yud Halacha Tes, where the Rambam talks about Masechet Shabbat, he mentions this concept.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Sorry, yes, Paul. Yes, the question was where do we see explicitly that tzorchei is a tolda of the av? And the answer is we don't see it explicitly. It could be tolda, it could be tzorchei makes it a co-av in some situations. Rather than it being a tolda of the av, maybe it's a co-av with the av itself. In a Masechet Shabbat, where the Rambam says explicitly tzorchei, he doesn't say if it's tolda. Similarly, in Maccabes, in Kibbutz, he doesn't say explicitly that it's a tolda.
Well, Kibbutz is a tolda itself. Kibbutz is a tolda.
Correct, but he doesn't say whether whether schita, that sort of schita, is a tolda of the tolda effectively, or whether it's equivalent to the kibbutz itself. However, in Ein Hatzeva, he says explicitly it's a tolda, but there he doesn't say explicitly that it's a tzorech, but that's how many of the Mepharshim understand it. And similarly in Shiur Chitin, he says it's explicitly a tolda, though again he doesn't say tzorech, but that's how many of the Mepharshim understand it. So just to sort of summarize this, we have several places where the Rambam explicitly says something is a tzorech, and he doesn't say explicitly if it's an av or a tolda. There are several places where he seems to be talking about a tzorech type thing, where he doesn't say explicitly it's a tzorech, but there he does say mefurish it's a tolda, and the Mefarshim and the Rambam understand this to be another tzorech type thing. So it's not entirely clear if a tzorech makes it an av or a tolda. It would appear the Mefarshim assume it makes it a tolda, or at least can make it a tolda, but it's not entirely mefurish. The truth is, for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. Meaning, as I said, it's not entirely clear what makes something an av or a tolda, but we do see in the Rambam this theory that a tzorech, something that is a stage in the process and a necessary prerequisite and a need of the melacha, also achieves melacha status of some sort or other, whether an av or a tolda.
Surely in our case, it has to be an av. Where Rashi refers to it as a tzorech. So it wouldn't make sense in the Gemara to say that Melicha, when you say you can take out either one of them, that can't be. Presumably Rashi's assumption is that they're both on.
Not necessarily. Either the Gemara means.
Could you repeat the question?
I'll repeat the question. Sorry, apologies. So this is a learning curve. So the question was, in Rashi, surely it has to, since Rashi is explaining the Gemara as being tzorech of the melacha, that Melicha is tzorech ibud, surely, and the Gemara says, Hainu Melicha, Hainu Melech, Hainu Ma'abed, surely that means to say that they're both of us. Now, that's not necessarily the case. There's two ways to explain the question of the Gemara. Either the Gemara means they're both co-of us, and therefore shouldn't be listed as two, but as one, because they're similar enough that they should count as one av. Or the Gemara means that one is a tolda of the other, and therefore you should only list one in the Mishnah, because don't forget, the Mishnah is a list of avos melachos. Let's not forget the Mishnah. We're coming from the Mishnah in Ein Gimel and Aleph, which is listing the 39 avos melachos. And therefore, what is a tolda doing, gate crashing the party, and ending up in the list of the avos? So those are the two ways of reading the Gemara. Having said that, and this I don't fully understand. The Gemara says, "Apik chad minayu," take out one of them, which seems to imply that the Gemara doesn't care which one you take out, meaning to say they're both of us, and either of them could be the dominant one, and the other one could be the junior partner or the equivalent partner, and therefore the Gemara doesn't care which one is taken out. Now, if Melicha only makes its way into the list because this is a tzorech of ibud as a sort of preparatory necessary step, then the Gemara shouldn't say apik chad minayu, it should say apik Melicha, take out Melicha and put in sirtut. So in the language of the Gemara, I hear, Jeffrey, your comment. In the logic of the Gemara could have meant either when it asked the question of hainu. It could have either could be the av, either could be the tolda. Maybe it's assuming ibud is the av and Melicha is the tolda. So I don't know. And I want to come on to that point in a minute of apik chad minayu.
I just ask this word sorah.
Yeah.
Within the Rambam, there seem to be two different meanings for it. So in the case of sewing, when he says it's sarah and Shiur, no one would say that the sewing process, which is sticking a needle in and out, preparing the thread, is part of that process. So you understand sorah to mean there's something that I need to do before I can do the art.
Yes.
And that becomes a tolda. But in the case, for example, of washing a garment, when you squeeze it out, that seems to be an integral part of the process. So there seem to be two different uses of tzarche. Here in our Gemara, Melicha is absolutely part of the Ibud process. There's an overall tanning process. And you go through various stages of tanning. And sorting it is not preparation for tanning, it is tanning.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll repeat the question. Thank you. And I'll comment on it. So I'm going to actually half agree with your question, and was about to say a similar point to the second half of what you said. So the question was, is the term tzarche used symmetrically in all cases, or does it refer to different things? Now, I'm actually not going to fully repeat Eliyahu's question because I don't fully agree with everything you said. But it's true to say that when we look at the Rambam's scenarios of tzarche, they don't all interconnect with the melacha in a symmetrical way. So tautening a thread as part of the sewing process seems necessary in bringing the cloth together. I mean, if you can weave a thread in and out of a cloth, if you don't tighten it, it won't be brought together. Soaking grain isn't always necessary as part of the melacha, but apparently is useful sometimes in speeding up or facilitating the germination process. creating dye, ein hard sover, would seem necessary as preparation for the melacha. So in the Rambam's examples, I think it's okay to say that they're all somewhat detached from the melacha itself and somewhat preparatory, even though they're not all exactly the same. But I agree with the second part of what you're saying, which is that when I saw Rashi and this Masechet Ibud, I got quite excited because it reminded me of, as I said, of the Omud previously, in which the Gemara talks about Melicha and this Rambam. However, upon rereading Rashi, it may be this whole thing is a mistake, and it may be that Rashi means that this is literally part of the Ibud process rather than preparatory to the Ibud process. And therefore, Rashi is saying, which fits the language of the Gemara better, that this is a ko'av rather than a tzorche, a preparatory one. And it really, the devil is in the detail, which is both probably knowing more about the tanning process and also conceptually how to conceive of it. Is the melicha literally one of the steps in the tanning process? In which case, we're misreading Rashi. And when Rashi says it's mitzorche tzorech ibud, he doesn't mean to say it's needed for the ibud, but he means it's needed as part of the ibud, in which case they're both ibud type melachos and they're just different stages in the ibud process. Or does Rashi mean it's preparatory to the ibud? It's necessary before you tan, you have to salt a cloth in order to dry it, in order to then be able to tan it. I suppose this depends both on the chemicals of the process, what exactly tanning is, but probably also conceptually. I assume if you just salt a cloth, it doesn't achieve what tanning is meant to achieve, which is softening it and drying it out sufficiently. Then it can be used for 100 years as a leather jacket or as a belt or as a piece of parchment, and it will never go moldy. In which case, there's a conceptual question over here. How do you view an earlier step, which is a stage in a process? Do you view it as preparatory for the final process? In which case, it's the Av Malacha, the true Av Malacha is the Ibud, because that's the only one that achieves the goal. And this is earlier steps in the process. Or do you view it as, since each bit presumably does some building block in the final outcome of getting a good piece of leather or parchment, do you view it therefore as one of the actual tanning process ones, in which case it would be a co-Av Malacha? So just to summarize, there's two ways it seems to me to read Rashi. One is that Rashi means it's a tzorech ibud, it's a necessary prerequisite for ibud, and it's analogous to the previous Rambams that we saw, and that would make it a melacha because it's a prerequisite, perhaps a junior melacha, perhaps a tolda, but definitely it seems it's conceptually junior to ibud because it's just preparation for ibud. And the alternative way of reading Rashi is that he's saying, no, since this is part of the tanning process, this is all subsumed under the name of the melacha of ibud, of tanning, or melicha. They're just different steps, but they should all be co-others. The latter reading is preferable in terms of our diuk of apik chad minayu va'ayil chad, in which the Gemara says take one out and put one in its place. And it doesn't seem to care which one you take out, just apik chad minayu, take out whichever you want, which would seem to imply that the Gemara considers them both to be equal partners in the shame of the Av Malacha, rather than one as a junior one and one as a senior one, which therefore seems to imply that Sorech Ibud doesn't mean it's a necessary prerequisite for Ibud, but means that it is actually part of the tanning process. It's a stage, and therefore is an Av in its own right, and therefore the Gemara doesn't really care which one it is, since they're both necessary and equally necessary in the process. Sorry, Josh.
So you've seen that with melachot, they all have, you've got the action and the actual purpose that you're following.
Yeah.
It seems if the rather that purpose is some sort of preservation, it was something which was perishable, and now it will go to something that is.
So it seems, yeah.
Like that.
Yeah.
And then, so if that is the case, then salting is sometimes preparatory. If we're going to say that the tanning process is first you salt to remove the moisture, then you add the chemical to preserve.
Yes.
But we see that on the Gemara, the salting of the meat is actually, that is the ibud, that is the
Yes.
preservation. So you see it is both.
Again, I don't know, but it may be that with food or with meat, where you're only trying to get short-term preservation, the salting is enough. And with other things like leather, where you want it for long-term use, you need also the tanning process. There is discussion in the poskim I left it really to the end of the sugya. Ibud, what the definition of the melacha of Ibud is. Gedem abed, I put it as the last thing on the source sheet, because I wasn't sure how to start the sugya, which point we start with first. But there's discussion in the postscript. If the definition of Ibud is preservation, how long does it have to be preserved for it to qualify? Now, salting meat preserves it for some time, but not for sort of infinitely long. Whereas leather, we know, can last thousands of years. I mean, it's we find leather, parchment scrolls, and so on, which are thousands of years old. So those can discuss how long the preservation has to be, and this will really get us to the end of the Gemara, which is why I left this discussion then to then, in which the Gemara makes this chiluk between the Beisei and the Orchei, whether you're trying to preserve it for your house or for your journeys, and that will get us back to this discussion about what's exactly how long Ibud is. So it may be that for the tanning process of producing leather or parchment, Melicha is only a step or not enough, whereas for something else, maybe it's an independent in its own right. I'm effectively trying to take you through my own confusion around this and retrace my thinking, in which probably both due to a lack of understanding of the concepts and a lack of knowing what happens in tanning, I'm a little confused as to what the relationship between Melicha and Ibud is. Is it preparation, or is it its own step in the tanning, in the preservation process?
May I ask just a more fundamental question?
Yes, Paul.
Are both Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan implying that the Mishnah is wrong?
Okay, so this is a separate question. What does the Gemara mean when it says apik chad menayu? What does it mean? Take one out. It appears that they're suggesting to amend the Gersa, to amend the text of the Mishnah, and they're suggesting that somehow the Masorah of the Mishnah that we've received is inaccurate, but it's not entirely clear what they're doing in the answer. Yeah.
Can I just make 2 points from the Persian Mishnah to Rambam, just in terms of seeming to support that it's an of. He says, who min mimine ibud. The Melicha is min mimine ibud. The Zacharosai, the Lametta, Melicha ibud. So it seems, in terms of saying it's a preparation versus it's the org itself, it seems very much down on that side.
Yeah.
And just and with that, the Zacharo side would seem to suggest that there's not a mistake in the mission. The Tana didn't get it wrong. The Tana put it there on purpose. The Zacharo side and the Meta, so I was wondering, no, I'm don't make mistakes.
Right. So I'll repeat this point just for the listeners. It is clear that whatever the Peshat in Rashi is, that there are Rishonim who definitely consider it to be a melacha itself. And I printed on the source sheet 2 Rishonim that say that explicitly. One at the bottom of page 1, in which the Ritva says, Hainu molchoi, hainu ma'avdoi, pirisha ibud shem kloli b'chol melachos ibud shaba'olam. So the Ritva at the bottom of the first source sheet says that ibud is a general term for all the melachos of ibud shaba'olam, all the different types of preservation processes that there are in the world. In other words, any form of preservation that you make would be called ibud. So the Ritva, it seems to me clearly, is learning that Melicha is just another form of ibud. And in fact, perhaps not even like Rashi at all, that it's part of a stage or process. It's its own form of preservation. It's an independent, parallel way of preserving. A bit like Joshua's Torah, that when it comes to food, at least, salting seems to be its own preparation process. Now, the Rambam also speaks about preparation. The Rambam, by the way, brings us to the subtlety of how long does the preservation have to be, because he doesn't say it's perfect preservation. He says it's that it won't quickly go off. So any form of delaying the kilkul process, he doesn't say how long, would count on it. And he says it's a type of the ibud type. So the Rambam himself seems like the Ritva, min ibud seems to be not that it's a stage in the process, it's another way of preserving things like the Ritva. The reason I'm bringing the Rambam in explaining Rashi isn't to argue that this is how the Rambam learns ibud and Melicha. It isn't how the Rambam learns ibud and Melicha, both from the Persian Mishnah and from Mishnah Torah. He gives no allusion to this. I'm simply saying when Rashi says it's mitzarchei ha'ibud, Rashi left me confused. So the Ritva and the Rambam are clear that melicha is seemingly a parallel form of preservation. There's lots of ways of preserving things. One method is tanning, but salting is another way of preserving things, and this is a perfectly good way of preserving things. It's Rashi who got us into this confusion, because Rashi says it's from Masechet Ibud, which seems to imply Rashi knew how to write, right? That Rashi knew how to say things clearly. If Rashi was meant to say it's its own independent method of preserving, he would have said that. And he doesn't say it's its own independent method of preserving. Rashi seems to say it's the tzorech of ibud, and therefore it was Rashi that led to triggering this thought. What does Rashi mean? Does he mean it's tzorech ibud, therefore it's a ko'av, or does he mean it's tzorech ibud, and therefore it's somehow subsumed into ibud itself? And Rashi remains unclear to me, and I'm simply trying to point out the lack of clarity. Rashi is a confusing. His comment is confusing. To me, it's confusing in this Gemara what exactly he's adding in. But you're definitely correct that there are Rishonim that learn that this is a parallel melacha to an alternative way of preserving things. I want to point out, by the way, just because I was sort of reflecting on this, I don't think this means that if you store meat in a vacuum pack something, that there would also be a melacha on Shabbos. Because there, I think you're creating the environment which stops it going moldy, because you vacuum packed it and therefore you removed the oxygen, and therefore I assume stopped the various microbe reactions that take place that let food go moldy. You haven't actually preserved the food itself. I assume the melacha of ibud, or preservation, is where you change the structure of the object itself such that it is preserved. But anyway, that's Shittas Rambam, and would appear to be the view of the Ritva that preserving foods, melicha is just an alternative method of preserving food.
How does that fit when you put it in the freezer?
Again, I think probably the same environment, the environmental story, as opposed to a fundamental change in it.
But the freezer, when you freeze it, it changes it.
It does, but the way it preserves it is not by is not because of the change in the object. It's because it stops the reactions taking place, slows down the reactions taking place, like when it's cold and very cold. The fact that the food ends up frozen is simply because the liquid in it freezes, but the preservation of it is the change of environment as opposed to the object itself. And again, the microbes just can't react, and the microorganisms don't manage to make it go moldy. So this was my attempt. I'll come to the second point in a minute, but that was my attempt at understanding what's going on over here amongst the melachos. Now, I was again going to come onto this later when we looked at Ma'avid, when we looked at the Perush Mishnayos, but Elio is absolutely right that the Rambam also seems to understand that the Mishnah, rather than changing the Girsa in the Mishnah, the Rambam says that conceptually we need to take out ibud and add in sirtut. And he says the Mishnah knew what it was doing when it listed melicha, because it wants to make clear to us that ibud is lav dafka. Any method of preservation is a good method of the preservation of the melacha. And similarly, the Mishnah didn't list sirtut because it saw sirtut as merely machshirei hakasiva, as a preparation for writing. Now, I don't want to go into this in too much detail because we need to look at sirtut by itself as its own melacha. So for now, I'll simply say that the Rambam understands that sirtut is preparation for writing. And he says the Mishnah doesn't list it because it didn't think of it as I think the Rambam means it didn't think of it as an independent melacha. It thought of it simply as preparation for the melacha of kosev, and therefore it didn't list it. However, it did list ma'abed and moilech in order to tell you that melicha is another type of ibud, and any method of preservation is enough. Now, I don't know, therefore, at the end of the day, how the Rambam is reading the words of apik chad and ayil chad. Now, apik chad, take out one is fine. It means the Rambam says, don't amend the Girsa, but take it out in your mindset of seeing it as a separate melacha. When it says melchem abid, that meant that's one melacha. But then it says ayil chad, which is put sirtut in place, and the Rambam seems to be saying that the time of the Mishnah held that sirtut shouldn't be in place. So again, this remains a little bit of a puzzle, but I'm aware that we've passed our time limit, so we'll revisit that at the Imit Hashem when we get up to looking at what sirtut is and what ma'abed is. So we'll stop there, and I wish everyone a good day. And Baruch Hashem, thank you so much for us all being here.
Chatima tova to you and
Chatima tova to everyone. Everyone should have a year of bracha and success, and looking forward to our continued Talmud Torah together.
Thank you.
Yeah. Next week. Yeah. No share this.